What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am a game designer on the Summoner's Rift team, and I'm here to talk about patch 13.8 that is either going live or already has gone live on a server near you. Patch 13.8, as you can see by the title up here, is the patch for the mid-season invitational in 2023, and I am fairly largely responsible for this patch, more so than others, because I had the most free time of anyone to take a look at pro play and make a fairly long list of suggestions for things to kind of do a follow-up on 13.7 that we should buff or nerf in or out of pro play. There's not a ton of changes because ultimately there's a lot that I thought was already in a good spot, but we can talk about that as we get to it. So 13.8, of course, is happening. Here is our big highlight slide. So Aurelion Sol, Jarvan, Kayn, Malphite, and Rakan nerfs. And buffs to Ezreal, Garen, Janna, Kha'Zix, Kog'Maw, Leona, Lillia, Nidalee, and Poppy, as well as the sort of second systems update to Cosmic Drive, some skins and whatnot as well, and I guess we'll go for the individual context for each change in those specific situations themselves. So let's go into the meat of the patch itself. Up first is Aurelion Sol. So this is a champion who has been received really, really well. I mean, awesome job by the champion designer who shipped the rework. I think it's been really awesome. This champion's really, really cool. Definitely skillful and sells the Cosmic Dragon fantasy, I think, really well. Better than the previous two iterations of the kit. So I think this is actually really, really cool. Yes, Aurelion Sol is too strong, and all champions need to be balanced. Ultimately, it's kind of interesting because Aurelion Sol definitely shipped in a state that was far too powerful. That's obviously true by the fact he's been nerfed several times and he's still winning in a lot of matchmaking bans. But I had kind of held in the back of my mind the like right way to release champions, and Riot's gone multiple ways in this before. This is my opinion. Doesn't mean it's the opinion of the team. It's just my personal opinion that like champions should actually launch a bit overpowered because players are bad at the champions. They haven't played them before. They don't understand the item builds. They don't understand the runes. They don't understand the skill order. They don't understand the play style. And so that takes time to figure out. And I think it's okay for a champion to ship a bit strong and guaranteed to be nerfed after 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks. But that's okay because people should be able to have fun playing a new champion, and their teammates should be able to not be sandbagged by someone playing a new champion. Whether it's in ranked or normal games or anything, whatever. Yeah, I play normals with friends and I play new champions all the time. And I expect we're going to lose when that happens. But I don't know, personal taste, I believe that champs should come out a little bit too strong. That's just my take. Either way, Aurelion Sol ended up shipping this way indeed. And here's another patch for nerfs. Ultimately, Aurelion Sol is really, really low MMR skewed in terms of win rate. A general rule of thumb here is that late game scalers tend to be low elo skewed. Now, that doesn't always end up being the case. Caston is an example of a champion that's actually relatively flat with MMR compared to a champion like maybe Kale or Aurelion Sol, where this is really obviously what happens, or another champion that comes out with some really good late game scaling and is kind of totally fine across MMRs. But you have champions like Nasus where they're really low MMR skewed because of the stacking mechanic. Veigar's in that boat as well. So there's some give and take. Either way, Aurelion Sol is getting scaling-based nerfs. So health growth is going down by a hearty 5, armor growth going down by a solid 0.3. This puts Aurelion Sol at a pretty squishy spot overall, but this is a champ who buys Rod of Ages, the champ who can often buy Rylays, and ultimately gets a lot of health and durability through his item purchases. So it's not like he's, doing a Syndra build where it's Ludens into sometimes straight up Void Staff second and then Death Cap third. Either way, Aurelion Sol actually has the durability through his build to work with this, and it's fine. And base stats are just one of the tools, but again, it's growth-based base stats getting nerfed. This is a nerf, again, for lower MMR solo queue, and so here is the table of his health before and after. Down a solid 4%. Here is the amount of armor he has before and after. And then this column here is doing the math on both his health and armor differences in terms of what his functional health pool is against physical damage. That's down as much as 6%. Now, of course, again, as he buys a Rod of Ages, as he buys even something like Seraphs, or he buys Rylays, he's going to get value out of he's going to sort of bridge that gap health-wise, and the percentage gets smaller and smaller when the rising tide lifts health before and after the patch, but still a pretty solid durability nerf again towards the late game, and so his ability to get picked off helps find some level of counterplay to the fact that yes, his champion does among the highest damage in the game late game, but hey, maybe he's a bit more poppable, and I think that's a positive thing overall, so pretty solid change. Not much to say here, I think it's a good change. So next is the first of the champions that I suggested that we buff for pro play. I believe I may have suggested Ezreal for buffs earlier on in the year. We had dragged our feet a little bit over the course of the year because of how many systemic AD carry updates there have been. So 13.1 micro patch, which would have been 13.2. We had the functional buffs to Infinity Edge and Navori Quick Blades, and as well as Bloodthirster. In 13.3, we did a bunch of support changes to make engage supports better, and Ezreal is a really common pick for, oh, my support's going to go roam into something else, Ezreal's going to sit 1v2, so if tank supports get better, engage supports, roaming supports get better, Ezreal is, you know, a little bit more attractive as a pick overall. And then 13.6, I believe, is the patch where there were a bunch of systemic AD carry stuff. So this was a nerf to Quick Blades, it was a nerf to Legend Bloodline and Bloodthirster and Lethal Tempo, pretty much none of which Ezreal actually runs. It was another example of like, well, maybe, you know, he'll just win because of systemic changes. And so after, yeah, this is the interesting thing about one of the Reddit memes of like, it's the Riot special, you change their item and the champion in the same patch. Of course this happens. Like, well, Ezreal was, I mean, you could argue a benefactor of 3 different systemic changes. I mean, Quick Blades second being good for him is, right, his new core build is Essence Reaver and Quick Blades, right? So there were 3 different patches of systemic changes that functionally hit Ezreal, and none of them had an impact in pro play, and I think they had negligible impact in solo queue. So anyway, after a full split under our belt of no, Ezreal really isn't a popular champion, and any champ who is not in pro play and has a sub 50% win rate, I am always going to champion for buffs. There's an interesting discussion here, which is that, like, Ezreal doesn't necessarily need more power to be satisfying for solo queue play. There is a line between like, and even like objectively strong is actually incorrect. This would be subjectively strong, because like, well, what if Ezreal players tend to not be experienced Ezreal players, and he actually is just like, everyone who gets autofilled AD carry just gravitates playing Ezreal because he's safe. That is a possible result, you know, or a possible influence on Ezreal's win rate, right? So Ezreal is subjectively underpowered via measuring data without giving it much analysis. You know, maybe Ezreal's actually fine in the hands of people who know him, and he doesn't deserve to have buffs, and that might be a reasonable statement. I don't think Ezreal's unfun to play, right? I don't think he feels severely undertuned. I think the champion is mostly fine, but again, in terms of, hey, who can we give 3 base AD to? Who can we give some win rate and not give win rate to, and take and give... I think Ezreal deserves to get some win rate because he's sub 50, he's not in pro play, and in general, I'm kind of the more the merrier sort of fan, so cool, some small changes to Ezreal here. Ultimately, yep, getting buffed for a bit more of different kinds of champions at MSI. Varus has been a top 3 AD carry for the entire split. He wasn't always playing poke, though recently he's about 3/4 or so poke build and about 1/4 on hit. Either way, Ezreal as a second poke marksman I think is fine. I don't think there's a problem with teams once in a while playing poke as their intended role down there. Again, they can play weak side bot lane with someone like Ezreal being strong. We can maybe see teams play for Fiora and Jack's top lane instead, or Cassante. I think all this is fine, so I think there is room to buff Ezreal, and it's totally reasonable, and this is a lot of time spent on 2 base AD. Ultimately, I decided to not do math tables for things that are really obvious in terms of numbers. He's getting 2 base AD. You don't need to see a chart for this. He has 2 base AD. Worth noting that his Q is a total AD ratio. This does bump his Q damage by, I think, 2.2. I think it has a 1.1 total AD ratio. Regardless, a bit of damage with basic attack, bit of damage with Q. This does mostly affect his early game. One thing that I had brought up when suggesting buffs here was actually to... so there's actually, we spent some further time on this discussion. I said discussion, I'm just talking at you. Of, hey, in what way should we buff Ezreal? So the ultimate impetus for this buff is really, hey, we want... a more diversity at MSI. Now, I actually think the pro meta is actually in a really good spot. We have a pretty wide variety of champions across roles. I think it's actually true. But hey, again, more than merry, we can add champs into pro play, because why not? We get more stuff going on, especially if they're really small buffs like this. There's no reason Ezreal should be 100% pick ban off of 2 base AD, right? That shouldn't make any sense. So, okay, we can buff specifically for pro play and say, hey, what are some things that pros will look at and like and say, because of this, I'm going to more readily consider Ezreal in this upcoming international tournament, which is a totally reasonable way to go about buffs. My initial suggestion was, hey, let's just buff Ezreal a pretty solid amount and low elo skew the buffs, because that's what Ezreal's win rate by MMR shows that he's actually worse off in lower MMR brackets than in higher MMR brackets. And Ezreal has typically been a champion who has had to sit at like 46-47% win rate for a lot of solo queue players a lot of his time because he's been pro-bounded. So it's like, well, if we're going to buff Ezreal, why don't we buff him in a low elo skewed way, kind of the opposite of the Aurelion Sol nerfs from earlier this patch, and say, hey, maybe we can get Ezreal to like a 48 or 49% resting win rate while he's occasionally in pro play. Why don't we swing, as like a first glance, this, what if we swung kind of larger and swung toward lower MMR? Ultimately, that's arguably more involved change list. People have other projects going on, like these are all changes that were like, sort of brought up and implemented within a span of a couple of hours ultimately. Most of the changes here are kind of like that because we have a lot of longer term projects going on in the team, myself included. But ultimately, it was like, let's just do a buff for Ezreal that is somewhat pro skewed that will say, hey, we're doing this for MSI. What if we can get a couple of pros to turn their heads and try Ezreal at MSI? So it is a early game skewed Ezreal buff, which should be a somewhat pro skewed Ezreal buff, and that is a change. It's a lot of time spent on 2AD, but there's the stories I remember it around the Ezreal buffs. Next is Garen. Garen, not my suggestion, though I think one that is totally reasonable here. This is a champion who is easy to play, and so this is back to what I talked about in the last patch rundown around Katarina, where champions like Garen and Varus as well, actually, there's several of these champions who they're easy to play, right? So imagine literally, right? Imagine the 1 million mastery point game players on every champ. You just like, there's a 1 million mastery Azir player, there's a 1 million mastery Darius player, there's a 1 million mastery Riven player and Zed player and Garen player and whatever. Should those players be balanced against one another at 1 million points? If so, then, right, they all need to be at this level of power. Okay, maybe you think mastered Garen should be worse than mastered Riven. If you believe that, that's fine. I'm not here to like tell you what you should believe. But, as a thought experiment, where should these champions live, right? At 1 million mastery points, how spread apart should these champions be, right? And you're going to have some point at which you're like, okay, at mastery point N, these champions are going to be equal. Maybe you believe that should be at 50,000 mastery. Maybe you believe that should be at 300,000 mastery. Whatever. I'm just using mastery as like a generic catch-all for like games on champion, time spent on champion, whatever. Like whatever your metric is, I don't care. But there is some point at which, if you believe you should balance them based on mastery, there's probably some rough break-even point, right? Okay, well, spoiler alert, most people are not 1 million mastery on their favorite champion. Shockingly, some people are higher on average than others. Riven and Katarina players tend to be higher mastery when you see one. Yasuo as well. Zyra is up there also. I think those are like 4 of the top 10. If I even mentioned 4. Katarina, Yasuo, Riven, Zyra. Yeah. So those are 4 of the top 10 in terms of like average mastery per game played. So those are champions where it's like, well, if you're balancing with that in mind, they should probably have really high win rates because they're going to tend to be brought up by mains. Okay. So to move on to the point I'm actually making here, which is that Garen is a relatively easy to play champion, but that means that most Garen players are playing near the mastery cap, whereas most, Aurelion Sol players and Azir players and Blitzcrank players are not playing near the mastery cap. So what should their win rates be? Because if you say they should be 50% on the current live League of Legends, that means the high mastery players lay at 55, 56, maybe even higher. Right, do you think that's the balanced League of Legends where, million mastery Garen is 52 and million mastery Zed is 57? If you believe that, again, I'm not telling you what to believe, but I don't believe that. So this is to say that, hey, okay, going again back to the point itself, if Garen's easy to play, that means people can't really into the play style. You can skill the wrong abilities, you can buy the wrong items, and you can account for that. You can look at that in data. But it turns out that like the average Garen is probably closer to like a mastered level of competence on this champion than the average top lane Cassante in virtually every MMR. So if you're going to use that as your jumping off point and use mastery as your index, Garen should probably have a pretty high win rate. Right? Because people aren't playing the champion wrong. Whereas like Cassante, people are playing the champion wrong. In Aphelios, people are often playing the champion wrong because he's much harder. Whereas like Varus and Misfortune are pretty easy to play, and so most people are playing them at a relatively high rate of mastery because there's not that much else to get. Obviously, there's a break point, right? There's a point at which you stop, and they shouldn't go any higher. But like that's a pretty compelling argument where it's like, okay, Garen is balanced, but everyone against him in lane are bad at their champions. Ergo, Garen should probably have a high win rate, right? That's kind of the logical argument here. And so I think, yeah, Garen's going to end up above 50%, but like only because he's beating people who don't know their champions well yet. And to me, that's like kind of reasonable, right? That like League of Legends says, hey, by the way, if you're bad at your champion, you're going to lose. And if you get better at your champion, you're going to win more. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but I think that's a reasonable overall statement and roughly where this lives. Anyway, let's talk about the numbers themselves. Garen gets 3 base AD. I believe both his Q and his E are total AD ratios. This also affect his spell damage as a result. He's getting 2 flat base armor, which isn't a huge deal because he does get a bunch of free armor from his W passive by last hitting minions. Ultimately, there's still going to be some level of durability increase, going to be some level of attack damage and spell damage increase. This should definitely be quite a bit of win rate, and Garen will certainly be strong in the hands of many, many players in this patch to come. I think there is a chance we see him in Pro. He is a very, very good K'Sante counter, and K'Sante is still I think a top 3 top laner pro. Maybe he's number 1, but he's certainly up there. And again, Garen is a very, very good pick into K'Sante because when K'Sante ults and he's stuck at roughly 50% max HP as his new cap, he counts as 50% missing HP. So Garen ult is guaranteed to do really, really big chunks onto him. I've played Garen K'Sante as a very bad Garen player into someone who clearly knew some of how to play K'Sante. You can kind of survive the lane on the K'Sante side, but like, yeah, team fighting is kind of dumb because you lock the guy down and he's pretty sad about it. Works pretty well. Garen's a good champion. I think we actually might see him a little bit of MSI because of these buffs. I think it'd be cool if we did. Next up is Janna. Janna is actually a similar case to the Garen case, where Janna is another one of the typically high mastered supports. So Zyra's up there as well. I don't remember if Thresh or Rakan are there, but I know Janna is like top quartile at least of relatively high mastered supports. Actually, a lot of the enchanters are. Just it turns out that a lot of enchanter players just, at least for specific enchanters, play a lot of those specific enchanters. So Janna is one of them. Again, Zyra, I think, is the literally number 1 support for average mastery when played. I think Janna, again, I said top quartile, I don't remember exactly, but we're going to move on because, again, I can't remember. But Janna is up there as a champion where, kind of like Garen, where Garen's easy to play, so everyone's high to the mastery rate. People just actually high to the mastery rate on Janna. Zyra, again, in this boat. And so, again, if you're going to balance on mastery, which is my current train of thought, actually, that I think balancing around mastery is a really good first step in terms of like, hey, if you just like have a magic wand and you wave it and you say I'm balancing around X, and it's like I'm balancing around 350,000 mastery points, and every champion is the same win rate at every elo at 350,000 mastery, and if you're above it, congratulations, you have higher win rate than other people. Go. Janna would be one of those who would be one of the winners of that, as would easy characters like Garen. Anyway, moving on. Janna, I think, again, deserves a relatively high win rate, and so this is kind of giving her a little bit more of that agency. So 10 flat damage on Zephyr, as well as a slightly higher AP ratio. Worth noting, this ratio is pretty solid at this point. This is almost 400 AP to double. This is just barely over 300, so this gives Janna an aggressive AP ratio. It's like 330 or something to double the damage. It's actually a pretty aggressive ratio. That should feel pretty good if Janna is going to build ability power and like be a little bit of a carry. That's not really how he's going to build. She is an enchanter, a pretty defensive one at that. But hey, you get to kind of feel good about your spell thieves evolving and running an adaptive for stat shard. And if you get your Frostfang earlier and you buy your bits of your AP is like the component on your stuff. So, hey, congratulations, a bit more damage. It's just kind of nice. I'm always a fan of the AP ratios like being there so that you can like feel good about the stats you're getting. I think it's a positive. The slower decay timer on Eye of the Storm, of course, nice as well. This just generally reads as, in almost all cases, your shield strength is just higher. Like either your shield does nothing at all, in which case I think it just fully decays at the end of the duration no matter what. So if you don't block any damage, you just get the full AD buff and nothing changes. And if you take some damage, the shield will last longer and block more damage. And so it is either nothing in the case if you didn't take any damage at all, or it is just strictly buffed in the case of it you being in combat in any way at all. Unless it was getting popped in the first 1.25 seconds, of course, then it was going to be identical. But other than that, it's just a strictly stronger ability. So these are pretty big buffs to Janna. I don't think it's going to be like 5% win rate or anything, but good buffs to Janna overall. This one we do have numbers on. Flashbang warning. So here's Janna's W damage, and this is assuming you have 15 ability power at level 1. I believe that is how much you get from Spell Thieves plus a stat shard. I could be wrong, but close enough. And then 270 AP is level 18, which again is really unrealistic for Janna to reach, a support to reach in general. But hey, if you actually manage to buy nearly a full build, of course, Solid Death Cap, cool, it's going to be up to 11% more damage on W at the end of that, but you can see it's really, really early game focused, 15% more damage, 10 more damage on the trade, and actually a bit more than that because the AP, yeah, pretty solid stuff. 11 more damage or so is nothing to scoff at, and a pretty solid Janna buff. Next up is Jarvan. This is a solo queue focused nerf. Even though Jarvan is very, very, very strong, he is really not seen in pro play. What's interesting is Jarvan still has this, we'll call it this aura of being the level 2 gank champion. You know, I just do red buff and then show up in EQ bot lane or whatever. And what's interesting is I think ever since he got the AD ratio on his W, that's no longer really been the case. He actually scales quite well with gold. And I would say vaguely on average, scaling well with gold tends to be a slightly low elo skewed thing for jungle. Because I think high elo is just really, really about snowballing early game and getting stuff done and getting your game rolling. It doesn't really matter if you're the carry as long as your lanes are ahead. You kind of just win through snowballing objectives, and then you checkmate the game, you choke your opponents out. Whereas I think late game scaling is a bit more low elo skewed. This isn't a very strong force, I don't think. Like Karthus is a high elo skewed jungler, at least for solo queue. Mastery is actually very, very flat by MMR. There's just enough skill express supports the kit now with the last few couple of reworks. W being really good, the instant you press it, Q having your choice when you exit. We're going about Mastery right now. But anyway, Jarvan is actually a low MMR skewed jungler. And he's a very high win rate, of course. So he's getting what I think are vaguely low MMR skewed nerfs. So attack damage growth, of course, is one of those. Where it's going to feel more at level 18. This is going to level 2, of course, what's going to do almost nothing at level 2. 10 flat damage on damage strike, of course, is certainly a more early game focused nerf. It's not this entire thing is low elo skewed, but a bit of that's happening. Okay, great, whatever. We do have data tables. Let's go ahead and show up those. And here is Jarvan's base AD before and after. This is assuming he buys no attack damage, which of course he will at in the real game. But here's his base AD before and after. It's down as much as 6% by level 18. As far as how much damage his Q is going to actually deal, and this is actually with some assumption for building around 4 bonus attack damage items, which seems pretty reasonable for level 18 jungler. 10 to eventually 2% less damage on the Qs. This will, of course, nerf his early ganking. This will nerf his early clear speed. I think there's a really good chance we don't see Jarvan in pro at all, unless work is done to somewhat un-elo skew the champion. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong, and pros still really like Jarvan. I mean, this champion is actually good. I think he'll still be very solid, especially in like sub-platinum solo queue, which is still like, what, 80% of players or something. Jarvan's still going to be very, very strong, just certainly less overpowered, and good that he's getting nerfed, because this guy is definitely maybe the #1 jungler in like sub-plat, so I think a very good thing to do to actually nerf this champion. Next is Kayn. So what's interesting is there's a really interesting separation. So this is obviously from a Western English-speaking perspective, where like people at me on Twitter and I read posts on Reddit, and I play solo queue in North America, and the players I play with play in North America, and so I have obviously for like the personal connections, like literally the people I speak with on voice and play games with are almost all American Canadian. They play in NA. But then like the posts I'll see are people who like they might follow Korean League of Legends or Chinese League of Legends. And it's the pro scenes there, or they're Turkish or German or whatever. But usually it's a bunch of English-speaking people, a bunch of like Europeans and North Americans is usually people I like see talk about the game. And so like, hey, I don't see a lot of Inven posts. I don't really have a good handle on the Korean solo queue experience personally without going and searching for it, except that like, well, okay, sometimes streamers go and play in Korea and you get a little bit of a look at that. And you get some of that, like the cultural sort of share back in a way, but like no one goes to China to play Chinese solo queue. So we don't have like that look in of like the easy route into seeing what's going on there. And in neither of those sort of regions are people kind of sharing over. And it seems as well that like a lot of the, I don't want to say this in a negative way because I don't mean it negatively at all, but the phrase my brain gives me is sort of negative. Like the fan, the like solo queue enthusiast community, like the solo queue fan community, that, again, it sounds worse than I mean it, but people are like, hey, I follow Korean Challenger solo queue and here's what I see. But I usually see it about Korean Challenger solo queue, not like Chinese challenger solo queue, like not on Ionia or the super server. There's like occasionally things there, but not very often, right? More often than not, Chinese pro players go and play on the Korean server. Not a lot of Korean players would go and play on the China super server, right? And so a lot of the solo queue, even if I'm like, oh, I'm trying to be plugged in and I'm checking out what people are talking about, that's still not looking at China very much. And China's a shitload of players and like home of what, like 5 of the last 7 world champions. I'm slightly exaggerating, but like very, very strong region, huge number of players there. And there's a lot less just like automatically socialized, like cultural beliefs from that set of servers, right? If that makes sense. This is all to say, hey, by the way, Kayn has like a 60% ban rate in Chinese solo queue. Did you know? Blue Kayn is like 55% win rate. I think it's like 50, or it's like 53, 54. It's something really, really high. And if you look at like internal data for like all like Riot regions, he's like 51. So there is such a huge metagame change in how the game is played or how players play on average that there is a literally like 3% win rate delta of Blue Kayn across like all Riot servers and Chinese players. That's a very, very big difference. And I'll bet most of you are surprised by this. I certainly was when I learned about this because, again, it's much harder for me to get that information just sort of casually, socially at my fingertips. But yeah, Blue Kayn is like the #1 solo queue problem. And so, yeah, hey, by the way, we should be paying attention to our players here at Riot, and we should make sure that, you know, our players all around the world are having a good time. And so, hey, by the way, Blue Kayn nerfs, because his champion is clearly far too high of a win rate. And again, right, we balance around various MMRs, we balance around pro play, we should balance around regional identities when we can. And it's a tough thing, and especially because, again, there's very little cultural assimilation, at least from what I can tell, between like Chinese solo queue and Korean solo queue. Like it's a little bit for high elo, but okay, fine. But that's still like 0.5% of players or less. And then, so that whole thing, right, it's just like, man, it would be nice if just like as a general league community, it was like easier for all the perspectives to be more easily shared, and that just like would be, to me, like much more interesting. You know, the kinds of things that people like and don't like and care about and don't care about, and the kinds of champions that are played, and just like, that's very interesting. And yeah, if you're like on Reddit or on YouTube, you miss out on, I mean, huge numbers of viewpoints. Like I think that the 2 largest server clusters, to my recollection, this is again just from memory, this could be wrong, is China and Vietnam. And I believe neither of those are like very heavily socialized in places like Reddit and Twitter. And I think that's really, really interesting, but it's like, oh, these are like really important perspectives that like I should certainly be looking at and looking for and trying to engage with. And that like the people like y'all who are watching this video almost certainly aren't engaging with, right? And I think it's kind of interesting. So anyway, Blue Kayn nerfs, the amount of move speed during his E, the amount of the duration on it as well going up. So some nerfs to Blue Kayn in terms of his overall mobility, his overall, the amount of time he spent functionally untargetable, the amount he's running in and out of walls and ganking you from across the map. Blue Kayn specific nerfs seems wise. Okay, we move on to Kha'Zix. So Kha'Zix got changes in the previous patch that seemed to be slightly power positive and moving him away from W evolve and into Q evolve. And with that just being like, here's a buff and a nerf combined, combined with probably some players coming into playing Kha'Zix who weren't before, and people having to relearn a bit of playstyle, Kha'Zix still gained some win rate last patch. Now, he arguably has room for a little bit more win rate buffs. I think that's fine. I didn't have much of a say in this. I didn't object by any means. I think it's fine he gets buffs. But a pretty simple buff to Kha'Zix via his Q damage going up by 10. Let's go check out the numbers. It's nothing much to talk about here. This is assuming some level of bonus AD, same as Jarvan 5 to 210, which is, you know, 4-ish completed bonus AD items, and his Q damage is up 15 to 2%. Of course, this matters a lot for his clear speed as well, of course. He's going to clear the jungle much more quickly. This is arguably a high elo skewed Kha'Zix buff. I don't know if Kha'Zix is elo skewed. I haven't looked. But cool. That's what's happening here with Kha'Zix. I think it's a pretty solid buff. Let's move on. Kog'Maw is on the table for some buffs, so we can scroll down a little bit and show you all of them. So his passive is getting stronger. He is now ghosted in the passive form. He is getting 15 to 100 more damage on this pop. Kha'Zix Spell down by 1 second, Void Ooze down by 20 to 0 on mana cost, and up by 10 to eventually -2 on the slow. So quite a lot of changes. Right now, the really common thing to do for Kog'Maw is to ignore E and leave it at rank 1 until level 13, which makes sense when you have a 20 mana cost 20% slow. That is a pretty bad button. That probably doesn't quite pass the bar for a level 1 skill feeling good, and I'm very glad this is the change being made. I think very smart by the designer to lower the mana cost to make it less inty and bring up the slow to a number that you can arguably feel pretty well. And honestly, going from 20% to a 30% slow is pretty meaningful, especially because it doesn't have a short duration, right? This is up for like, I think it's like 5 or so seconds. As you don't get off the thing, you're going to take longer the slow. And by the way, because the slow is higher, you're going to be on the thing for longer. This is actually functionally a slow duration increase as well, which is cool. Again, very big fan of the change. I think it's a very good change. I think this is arguably slightly dangly. I don't think it's a bad change by any means. It gives Kog'Maw some more to do. And honestly, I am also glad that, I think actually, so it's dangly, but I agree, is I guess what I'm going to say about this. So the point of me saying dangly is like, hey, it's a buff that doesn't do very much. Like I would say like this is a buff that doesn't do very much, right? Like if we buffed Kha'Zix this patch and all you saw was tree damage, whenever you'd be like, what the fuck are you doing? Like this is not a buff. What are you doing? If this was the buff on the patch by itself, you'd be like, what are you doing? Are you buffing your champion or not? This is stupid. And in isolation, yes, that would be weird. Like, why are you doing this at all? But I really like the idea of, yo dog, every time we buff Kha'Zix, we just buff his W. How about his other buttons can matter, please? Let's let him do something other than just auto attack for a living. Yes, sure, he's Kha'Zix the Void Cannon, and he, you know, like it's really iconic what his W does. Sure, but also, hey, you know, maybe his other buttons should actually feel good to use, and that's probably pretty wise. So yeah, cooldown down by 1 second is a pretty small buff, but again, it puts some power into landing Qs because you're going to be shredded more often, you're going to take the damage from this ability more often, you do max a second. Hey, Void is actually worth ranking at, you know, level 3 or something. Hey, it's actually pretty inexpensive, and it's a pretty solid slow. I don't think there's a reason to max Void Ooze once you're at 0.1 here. I mean, for one, the rank up incentive is actually more mana cost per rank than before. The slow incentive is less slow than before. And honestly, like, I don't see why you wouldn't just keep maxing Q second. It gives you 5% free bonus attack speed, which debatable if that should be there, but who cares? Whatever, let's move on. Either way, I think these are good changes, right? It's buffs to everything but W functionally, which I think is positive. Again, being ghosted during the passive form is a really, really big deal. This makes it very easy to land it, which is going to feel really good. The break points where you might just last hit caster minions or, you know, the cannon or whatever, or maybe trade a kill back is going to feel good. Like, this is definitely satisfaction up. I think we'll see a lot more Kog'Maw pick rate. His overall win rate is fine. I don't know what his mastery data is, if his win rate is being suppressed by low mastery or inflated by high mastery. I didn't look at that. But I think Kha'Zix has been really low pick rate, and he's not in pro play, and honestly, yeah, he's not like the most compelling fantasy of a champion. Like Kog'Maw will never, ever, ever, ever have the pick rate of like Jinx, Ezreal, or Caitlyn. That will never happen. Just like Lillia has never had the pick rate of Yasuo, no matter what their power levels were. Just some champions are far more appealing to far more players. Not that they're bad champions or their visuals are wrong or their theme is wrong or anything. Just like, hey, some champs are broadly appealing, and Kog'Maw is not one of those, and that's fine. But this will still spike his pick rate. That's cool. I think it's a, you know, fun champion. I like playing Kog'Maw personally. I think he's a cool champ. So yeah, these are buffs. We're going to go ahead and show some data. So here's the passive damage before and after. Pretty simple, 25 to 30 per level. But yeah, about 15% more damage via the passive is pretty solid stuff here. We can look at the mana cost of his E as well as the slow of his E, or of course going to max his last. So nothing much to talk about here. The mana cost is indeed down by a third. The slow potency is up by 50% for the vast majority of the game. Many AD carries, you know, by the time they've passed level 13, they've probably already, in many cases, you've already decided who's won that game at that point. There's many where, of course, you haven't, and the late game's going to matter, in which case, the theoretical level 18 Kog'Maw is worse off than before, except for every other level where he got more done and, you know, probably earned more gold and was more likely to win the game. So obviously, this is win rate positive to the champion, and cool stuff there. One more thing to note is that because you are going to probably put a point in Void Ooze at level 3, he's going to have less attack speed for levels 3 through 12. Because you're going to be 1 point behind on your Q. Is this worth it? Of course it is, but worth noting. And I'm glad that E is worth ranking up again. So Leona is coming in. This is one that I suggested that we do. I'd also suggest that we buff Alistar. So this is, we looked and saw that Rakan is the #1 support in pro play. We nerfed Annie support in 13.7, I think it was, or 6, I forget. But I think it was 0.7. And in addition to that, right, so Rakan was already number 1. With an anti-nerf, he was going to be easily number 1. He was probably going to be 100% pick banned for MSI. And he was really, really high solo queue win rate, especially in high elo. He's a high elo skewed support. And so we kind of had to nerf him. Now, I think Rakan and Thresh are, I will say, my belief, the 2 coolest supports in League of Legends that... like I will admit to playing favorites with the most exciting kits, that if we're watching pro play, as a shoutcaster for 10 years, if I'm watching pro play, I would much rather have a Rakan, Thresh, Lee Sin kind of metagame than top lane is Malphite versus Sion, mid lane is Orianna versus Syndra. Not that those champions aren't high skill oppressive. Actually, sorry. Orianna Syndra's fine. Corki versus Azir in mid lane. You know, like, there's just like, okay, so like, I don't need to get off topic too much here. Ultimately, there are champions that are better spectator champions than others. This is just, I think, definitively true, that there's champions that are more set than others. You know, 4 Enchanter AD carry meta was interesting for a very, very short time in was it 16 or 17? Oh shoot, I forget now. The one that Samsung beat T1 in the finals 3-0, where Faker played Karma mid and solo killed Crown a bunch and they still lost. Anyway, the AD carry centric worlds is like, well, that's cute, we did that once, but wow, is this game boring, where it's just about which AD carry can win and who can get Artisans to the first, right? Like, that's not a very fun pro metagame. So like, no, pro champions are not made equally. Guess what? So champs like Rakan, Thresh, Leona are more exciting for pro because they roam, they create action, they engage, they try to create kills. Like, yes, these champions are more interesting in pro play. Like, if I can keep a balance for solo queue, awesome, right? Like, I'm not trying to break solo queue. I want every type of champion to be viable in solo queue, but my ideal pro play like metagame is probably about 60-65% engaged supports and 35-40% everything else. That is my belief. Now, to be fair, engaged supports, again, make up like roughly half the roster of supports. There are only about 2 disengaged melee champions, and that is Braum and Tahm Kench. Every other melee champion is functionally an engaged champion. Taric is, yeah, halfway through, but whatever. And then, like, ranged champions, some are aggro. You kind of look like Renata Glask or Ashe or Senna, where they're pretty aggressive. You have defensive ones, or, you know, relatively defensive ones like Karma and Lulu and Soraka. Yeah, they can be lane bullies, but their teamfight output is very defensive. And it's like, hey, if both supports are defensive in nature, we just farm back and forth in bot lane and no one can die. And you're just playing, oh, who can play the greediest AD carry possible and get 3 items and win the game that way. That is a very boring pro play where one lane doesn't want to interact ever. If both players are playing Nautilus or Leona, then whoever's starting to lose the lane goes and tries to kill mid lane and stuff happens. Like, again, as a 10-year tenured shoutcaster, I like me some engaged metas in the bot lane. So yeah, now that I'm in a position to somewhat enforce this, or at least suggest that we go in a certain direction, yeah, I'm gonna try to make sure that engaged supports are the most frequent, most picked kind of support, while still wanting a bunch of variety. So I don't have the numbers at my fingertips right now, but I tweeted them out, and it was something like. So this was like patch 13.5 top regions by pick rate, and it was like 65 picks on what could be considered aggressive melee champions, like 3 on defensive melee champions, and 50 picks on ranged champions, which is like really quite varied. Yeah, it means we're not seeing much Braum or much Tahm Kench. Okay, sure. But ultimately, right, we have a very aggressive metagame in support. But it's still quite varied because it's like, oh, 60% of all picks are Vanguards, but 40% everywhere else. Cool, we have a really, like, a good amount of variety that's going really well overall. So, like, that's my sort of view on it, and that's the world we're in. So I'm not trying to move from the current pro meta much. And so, because we're nerfing Rakan because his win rate's too high, hey, I really want to buff someone up to help make sure there are plenty of viable engaged tanks to keep that sort of metagame going. I think the support metagame is actually quite good in pro play, and overall the support metagame is quite good in solo queue as well. I'm not trying to make big waves, but it's like, well, we do need to nerf something, and I'm going to go for these changes because of pro. Now, so Leona is roughly balanced. It's like 50.5% win rate. Like, she doesn't need solo queue buffs, to be fair. Again, this is for pro play. Alistar is at like 50% himself in solo queue. But looking historically, Alistar hasn't been meta in pro play in about 4 years. Leona was meta last year. I think for spring. And I was like, okay, well, yes, we did Alistar changes in the 13.3 patch, and then we had to get follow-ups 13.4 because I missed on the changes. We did buffs to Alistar in 13.7 specifically, but they were really small. It was like 0.5% win rate, and I'm like, look, we meant to swing harder in 13.7. We didn't hit hard enough. I think we could go for 13.8 and go for Alistar buffs. Because also he's newer, right? Like, he's functionally a fresher face than, oh, look, Leona's back. Like, I know there is some fatigue over Leona Nautilus being the meta. Like, I don't really want the Leona Nautilus meta because that was there for so long and it felt like all anyone played. Now, I would still rather have Leona Nautilus meta than Karma Lulu meta, right? Or Lulu Yumi meta, right? And I would say that most of you watching this video would probably agree with that. But I would still rather have the world where everything's out there, but it's slightly skewed melee. That's my belief. And again, if everything's viable in solo, you just play what you like playing and you're good. And that's still pretty much true. Again, Rakan being a bit OP notwithstanding. Again, it was like, hey, what if we do light buffs to Leona and light buffs to Alistar? Alistar being a fresher face, he'd, be a bit of a newer look in pro play. Wouldn't that be kind of cool? Ultimately, my understanding is there was some kind of bug with the changeless. I don't know what happened exactly, but they just pulled it from the patch and moved on. Again, Alistar was not a must buff, but it means Leona is kind of getting buffed to sort of take the place of Rakan. Not to take the place of Rakan's still going to be very good. He might still be the #1 support, but as he goes down, his presence goes down, Leona's presence goes up, and we keep a relatively similar amount of aggressive melee support in pro. So we are onto this. Now, I want to point out I did not do any math here. The magic damage on W is very easy to see. It's a 10 flat damage increase. Congratulations, her all-in window deals 10 more damage. I'd actually looked at a lot of supports when I was doing the 13.3 changes, and this is actually part of why I buffed Nautilus's passive damage by like 6 or something. Is I looked at the level 3 damage that every support could put out and was like, oh, okay, these are all pretty much equal. Leona doesn't necessarily need more early damage. She's fine. And so that was kind of the conclusion I came away with, was that she didn't need more early damage. I didn't raise the stink because the changes, it doesn't really matter. But this now puts her at, I think, roughly, maybe she's like slightly the most lethal support. As a result, if you perfectly trigger all of her passive procs, all the sunlight, you can get 3 hits that way. If you do all that, she can do the most damage to anyone, but also you don't often get all 3 pops. Either way, Leona's gonna have more damage. She's gonna be one of the most lethal supports, especially if you are able to get in ranged and pop sunlight every single time. The 5 armor MR bonus is nice, but keep in mind that Leona is nearly invulnerable during W anyway because of the flat damage reduction. That's also on the W, which is part of why doing this math, it wasn't very useful. Also, she frequently runs Aftershock, and so that's also on very often when using your W. So ultimately, I didn't think it was really that important to do all the math in this because, hey, it's 5 more armor and MR. Okay, cool, but there's so much more to the ability than that, and so much more to your durability when you're in the fight that it didn't seem like it was actually worth to do. So, okay, cool, right? Plus 5 armor, plus 5 MR, the percentage bonus difference, right? No difference at all. Cool, great, and 10 more damage. So, pretty small buffs. Again, 10 more damage, the all-in, 5 more armor, MR. Not a huge change, but Leona is, of course, going to be a little bit stronger. So next up is one of a suite of champions that I suggest that we buff for the upcoming patch at MSI. So what I spent a lot of time on is looking at, okay, what is the pro metagame? What kinds of champions are being played? How varied is this, right? Are we stuck in a rut in any given place in any given lane? And if we are, like, what's lacking, right? What's outside the rut that we're not in? What is a champion that pros, and the thing is, it's being opportunistic, right? Because I don't think we're going to be in a spot where, like, pros are going to start playing Neela now out of nowhere, or pros are going to start playing Nasus now out of nowhere, or pros are going to start playing, I don't know, Zed when they haven't played Zed in like 10 years. Whereas like, Lillia and Nidalee and Diana were my 3 biggest front runners, are things that we have seen in pro play, and to me are champions that we could buff and we could see happen. I think Yasuo from the previous patch was kind of like this. We have seen, a little bit of Yasuo in pro over the years, especially when Gragas is meta, and Gragas is meta right now. And so this was like, hey, what don't we see? We don't see damage-focused AP junglers. Like, we see some Gragas, but Gragas is increasingly becoming, I believe it was specifically a mid laner. I'd have to, like, double-check, but, like, I looked at the data patch over patch, and I believe it coalesced in toward mid lane. It was that or top lane, again, I don't remember, but it was, like, one of those two. Is okay, Gragas is going away from jungle in current pro trends, so we don't really have a lot of magic damage in the jungle. And it was like, well, pros have played Nidalee before. and Nidalee has room for buffs and solo queue everywhere except Challenger, basically. Lillia is currently low elo skewed, so we can ship pro skewed Lillia buffs. That's cool. Like, that's a good thing. And I mean, I'm a really big Lillia fan. I think this champion's great. She's one of my favorite champions. And as someone who's playing in Diamond right now, like, well, her win rate curve goes down as you approach my MMR, right? Like, I would like Lillia to be strong in my MMR because I like playing her. And I like when I play OP champs, not balanced champs. You know, I was a big Annie support abuser. Anyway, this is not about me. This is about Lillia getting pro skewed buffs. And again, the suggestion being, hey, can we buff a suite of AP damage focused junglers to try to get them into pro play and have a new look of champion? Because of course we had our slew of minor nerfs to Vi, Sejuani, Wukong, and Lee Sin. So the top 4 get hit a little bit. Of course, Elise is around. This is not ignoring the fact that Elise is there and that Gragas is somewhat there, but those are not damage-focused AP champs, right? Elise happens to be an AP champ, but she's just a turbo ganker, right? Like, she's just a different, like, she's actually not even Nidalee, right? Elise is there to, like, level 2 gank you and make her top lane or bot lane win the game and then fall off a freaking cliff. Nidalee is a champion that's like about turbo farming both junglers, mark the enemy jungler. Her ganks are kind of trash, but she's going to earn infinite gold and keep the enemy jungler from doing anything. And is like a high tempo aggressive champion who wants to snowball. That is a different champ from Elise. That functions very differently as a champion. There's really nothing in the pro meta right now that is like Nidalee. Viego's arguably the closest of a champ that actually wants to do individually high damage. Maybe Wukong, but Wukong's not a turbo clear, right? Wukong is still there for the CC ultimate. His ganks are kind of bad. He applies red buff and does 300 damage, then walks away. You know, like he stealths in and hits you a little bit. But like, oh, Lillia and Nidalee are actually much more unique. Yes, Lillia does have the ulti in the way that Wukong does, but still, I think Lillia is, I would argue, a much more damage-focused champion than Wukong is. Anyway, AP damage champions is a spot that we don't really have where, oh, I could play AD top, AD mid, AD bot, and with this jungler, my comp wouldn't feel like trash. Lillia is one of those champions, right? And Diana was as well, but Diana got shot down, I think, because of, I think it was from solo queue winner concerns, I don't remember, but Diana was not a popular pick, so we didn't go for Diana. Either way, so on to the Lillia changes. What's going on here? Okay, well, the early monster damage cap is going up by 20. This is a very big deal because every single large and epic monster, except for Big Raptor, hits the cap. And so this is your Q, I believe, I forget if it's like 30 or 40 base damage, but it doubles when you hit the monster. So it's like, okay, I did like 60 or 80 damage with my Q, and then I did 50 damage with the passive. And the Q cooldown is long enough that the passive drops off by the time you hit Q again. Then with your level 2, you can kind of like Q, then W, then Q again, then it falls off, but you can kind of like keep uptime for like 10 seconds. Either way, this is a very, very big deal, especially in your first camp, because it's just straight up 20 bonus damage per spell cast. Right? Like, if you saw a Lily buff and the Lily buff said, hey, your Q does 10 more damage, you'd be like, wow, that's a lot more damage. My clear is going to be really, really fast. That's what this reads. Like, functionally, it's almost identical. So that is what that does. It's going to make you clear red and blue and Krugs and Gromp much, much faster. Big Wolf also hits the cap. Again, the Big Raptor only hits part of this. It's at 1100 HP, so you're going to get like, that is going to be like 60 instead of 50, right? But again, a meaningful buff here, right? So, okay, early clear speed up. Early clear speed tends to be pro skewed. The next thing is healing as monsters is functionally up. Like, yes, the max rank of this is lower, but the AP ratio is tripled, and so we'll do the math a little bit, but this is just a strict buff to the amount of healing against monsters. So this is a two-pronged thing. So early jungle health and safety is also a good thing for pro play because you're going to get invaded less. You'll come out of your jungle with more health and thus be able to scrap for a Scuttle Crab or fight a mid lane 2-on-2 or a top lane 2-on-2 or a bot lane 3-on-3 more easily. Right, come out of your jungle and not only are you getting out of there faster because you've done several hundred more damage via your passive, saves you 5 seconds in your clear or whatever, and you're going to come out with more health because you're literally healing for more every time you do this. And so your first clear into the first skirmish is going to be healthier and faster and with more gold and more XP. Okay, cool. This also does is it helps really, really new Lillia players. I don't necessarily think this is going to be low elo skewed, but for actually new players, right, because Lillia does a lot of her damage literally while moving, right, her Q, she gets to move during it, and she's ranged functionally, she's really incentivized and rewarded for kiting camps. And if she kites the camps well, she will take a lot less damage. Really good players are good at kiting. Really new players don't know what kiting is. And saying, hey, we're not going to balance Lillia's clear around kiting. it's just going to be healthy. And this maybe could have even been higher, to be clear. But I went a little soft because we didn't have a lot of time for testing on this. It didn't feel hugely different as an established Lillia player. Playing it in playtest, it didn't feel that different. Obviously, it is faster, but it didn't feel massive. It just felt nice. But hey, really, really new Lillia players will get a benefit out of this. And elite Lillia players, of course, will just, if they weren't coming out at completely full health, are probably doing it now. And so, again, an elite skew buff for Lillia, which is, again, the part of her win rate, like by MMR, that she actually needs. So elite skew buff here. The final thing is actually not part of those goals. It's just kind of there because we were doing it. It's just a suggestion from, I believe it was her champion designer, but Lillia got an AP ratio on her healing relatively recently. This was when, a couple of years ago, when there were a bunch of changes that unpro-skewed Lillia, and they unpro-skewed her so hard they actually low-elo skewed Lillia. So we can kind of walk some of those back, some of those being early jungle clear. But one of the things that she got added was an AP ratio to her healing, which I think is actually a really cool thing. And I think Lillia is kind of coolest as a champion when she is playing kind of high risk, higher income, skirmisher AP carry. And there is a breaking point where an AP ratio on healing can be too high because, right, if she gets too far ahead of the curve, you know, she becomes invincible, right? And it's like, well, I have enough AP that I can shrug off anything you ever do. Ha ha ha, I'm the best. That obviously can become scary if the numbers get too out of whack. I don't believe these numbers are out of whack, especially the PvP ones who aren't getting changed that much. But it's obviously a really substantial increase to the PvE ones. But it's just basically saying, hey, you have an actual acceptable AP ratio on this part of your kit. Again, targeting the 300 to 400 band is usually like my giving it no deeper thought. What is probably a reasonable mage ratio, and it's 300 to 400 AP to double whatever the final rank of the ability does, is like, okay, this is probably an acceptable AP ratio. It's probably a solid AP ratio. And that's kind of where we're going here is this. So let's talk about the numbers and what's going on here with Lillia. So the passive damage cap, again, is up 20. You know, by the end of your first clear right here, it's still up a solid 17. Again, functionally per spell cast, you're doing 17 more damage. It's pretty useful overall. So definitely clear speed increase there for Lillia. And then here is the monster healing. This is actually assuming you're buying some ability power. Again, 330 AP at level 18 is a solid 4 AP items, assuming you're skipping Death Cap and doing other stuff instead. But if you're skipping Jack Show, if you are buying Jack Show, right, as your mythic, you're obviously going to have less ability power, and it's not going to look quite so green for you. But if you're doing a full AP build, you definitely heal for way more against jungle monsters. Again, this is just basically just saying, hey, the stat shard at level 1, which is what you're going to have in the second slot there. And then, assuming you buy some amount of ability power every level, eventually reaching 330 bonus AP at level 18, here's how much monster healing you get. And again, it's pretty early skewed. This was kind of accepted. This is understood. The PvP section is not nearly so aggressive. Now, this is actually somewhat being opportunistic in slightly nerfing top tank Lillia. Because if you don't build ability power, you can see that you're not really getting any more healing than before, because the numbers are the base went down by 30, but the AP ratio went up by 12%. In both these cases, by the way, it takes about 250 AP at level 18 to equalize the numbers. It's around there. It's 200 something for pre-post patch. But it's like, yeah, if you're not building ability power, right? If you are building ability power, you're like slightly better. You're a slightly stronger champion. But if you take detours to go Jack Show Frozen Heart, you're gonna have less healing overall in PvP combat, and the Kite Euphoria and Lillia is gonna be actually worse off there. I'm a pretty strong believer that I don't think tank Lillia should be acceptable. At least I think it should be weaker than AP Lillia. This is the same problem with like tank Echo and stuff like that, and tank Fizz, where they've got tools that are meant to be high tension for skirmisher kits. And if you're not a skirmisher, they're just kind of unfair tank outputs. That's generally how those kinds of tools work. And so, yeah, I'd pretty strongly defend getting rid of tank builds on skirmishers, because I think it actually just kind of breaks down the counterplay of the champion. So again, these are Lillia buffs and cool beans. Next, we have Malphite. Malphite getting nerfed for solo queue. He's in pro a little bit, not a ton. Malphite's solo queue data, his two most common matchups are still matchups where Malphite is winning. So, as much as Malphite's win rate is pretty high, and it is, people are still, on average, blinding stuff that gets beaten by Malphite without banning him, and that's a you problem. And when people ban Malphite, they're not getting frequently enough countered by things like Rumble, Silas, and Mordekaiser, who absolutely dumpster this champion. It's not even close. I don't know. Like, legitimately, I don't personally believe Malphite is a problem because he is so incredibly counterpickable. And I'm of the belief, as someone who plays a pretty big variety of champions, welcome to League of Legends. There's 150 champions. You should learn some counters. One tricking is like gonna have bad matchups, and you can deal with that. There are counter matchups. Welcome to League of Legends. That's how this works. Champ select matters, matchups matter, and how you play them out matters. That's the game. So personal belief, I don't really think Malphite needed to be nerfed because there are plenty of matchups where he gets completely dumpstered and he can't ban them all, and no one's really going to ban all these champions so they can pick Malphite. He's not that important. He's just really good in things that are popular, and people just let that happen. That's my belief. Whatever, I think this champion, could have been left alone. I think he also could be nerfed. His win rate is certainly very high, and whatever. I'm not like mad he's getting nerfed. I just didn't think he needed to be. That's just my opinion. Either way, damage is down, so flat damage decrease from the W rank up here. What's interesting is Malphite has a very large variety in builds. Something like, I think it was like 38% max W last, 20% max W first, another 20% max W second. I know that's not adding to 100%. This is just like the three most common like full skill orders is like QEW is 38%. WQE I think is the next one is 20, and then like EWQ or whatever is like the third one, or QW, whatever. Either way, like the three most common skill orders has W third, then second, then first, or third, then first and second, or whatever. And then it accounts for like 70% or so of his builds, or 80% or so of his builds. Either way, I think it's interesting. But this is going to, of course, nerf maxing W because he's getting 5 less damage on the initial active per rank up. So here's the data table. This is with an assumption of him starting out with 2 armor stat shards, then building another 320-ish bonus armor. This is before his passive. The passive is multiplied against this afterwards. But this also assumes that his passive shield is broken, but the W passive is still giving him 10 to 30% more armor. So here is the W active damage, the first 7 levels. Then it goes down to about 11% less damage. Now this is, of course, the damage that the W itself is providing. This is not accounting for his base AD in there as well. Here is the splash damage because the armor ratio is nerfed. It is, as far as I can tell, a total armor ratio, which means you're going to feel it right away, going from 20% total armor to 15% total armor. And so, yeah, a pretty solid amount of wave cleared down, about 10% less on the first active, and about 10% less on the follow-up attacks as well. So definitely going to feel that. Definitely going to, do just sort of much less overall brawling damage to the champion. Okay. We go on to the second AP jungler buffed for MSI, and this is Nidalee. I think there is room for larger work. I think it's going to be tough, though, to still make sure this champion feels good to play while trying to maybe un-elo skew Nidalee. So right now, Nidalee is a perfectly acceptable challenger elo solo queue pick. She is not in pro play, and she's really, really bad in the hands of most people in solo queue. If you want to read the context paragraph, go ahead. But basically, TLDR, you can explain some of the win rate skew by champion mastery, but only part of it. A lot of the win rate skew is simply that she is entirely an early game snowball champion, which means you have to master her jungle clear. You have to then master counter jungle. You have to master early pressure. And if you do that, you'll win about as much as other champions in Challenger. And in Silver, where your teammates cannot be relied upon to follow you onto good invades, cannot be relied upon to follow up on your ganks well, to save their CC, or just flash Nautilus passive people when Nin's coming to gank, she can't use her strengths as well. There aren't the best levers for making Nidalee's late game better. They can exist or they can be invented. I have theories, but either way, this was meant to be low scope patch changes, and TLDR, it's like, hey, I'm going to soften being bad at Nidalee's early clear. She's already a very fast clear. She's already a pretty healthy clear. Getting more armor, kind of like the Lillia changes from the previous patch, isn't going to affect really high MR players that much because they're already very, very good at the clear. Not going to take that much damage. But if you're not good at Nidalee's clear, you're going to use this for armor pretty effectively because you're going to take a lot more hits from the jungle. So this is probably a low elo skewed armor buff. Now that said, if you're high elo and you are going into your first PvP combat, you're fighting over Scuttle, you're fighting over bot lane 3-on-3 or whatever, having 4 more armor matters a lot against Poppy and Wukong and Lee Sin and all these champions. It's going to affect you quite a lot when a failure tries to auto attack you 5 times. Then armor growth in general, certainly rather high, going up to 5 here, but this is of course a late game skewed buff, which in general late game tends to be good for Nidalee. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs rather. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Late game tends to be good for lower MMRs. Then it's going to be a bit more durable in late game. And yeah, it'll be something. This will be some solid amount of win rate. I think there's a decent chance we see some Nidalee in pro play, but this was, an honest, hope at giving her some buffs. And this is not going to fix her win rate by MMR skew entirely. It'll probably make some gains here, which is good. And fair enough. That's what's going on here with Nidalee. We do have math for that though, so we can go ahead and say, hey, Nidalee has 3% more physical durability at level 1, trending to 4.4% more durability at level 18, assuming she buys 0 armor items. Of course, if she buys Azonia's, she's going to have the extra 9 armor is going to mean a bit less overall, but whatever. There's a champion. One more jungle coming in though is Poppy. Just has room for buffs as a champion. Should theoretically be pretty good in a metagame that has Wukong and Vi and Lee Sin in it, all the champions who dash a whole lot. Sejuani would also care. So theoretically, Poppy should fit. I think she's usually a pretty cool champion. She's pretty inoffensive when she's strong. Just an overall solid champion. I like this champion, good champion. Isn't necessarily weak in solo queue by any means, but I don't think it's a problem to buff her. And again, it gives us some more variety in pro play. But I think she's just overall cool champion. Glad we're seeing it. And yeah, a bit more PvP damage on the Q. I'm pretty sure she hits damage cap on every meaningful camp already on the Q, so it's not going to affect her jungle clear. And then a bit more armor MR with steadfast presence, which is actually not a very, very big deal. We can look at some math here. So this is assuming 5 to 90 bonus AD is basically Divine Thunder +1. This is like Divine Thunder or GA, roughly by level 18, around there. This is like the total damage of Q against a champion if you hit both halves of it. So 1% more max HP damage equates to about 6% more damage against the champion overall, assuming you build a little bit of attack damage to the champion. Again, about 2 attack damage items. This is 110 bonus armor and MR. So, 220 bonus total resist basically on the champion. This is how much average between armor and MR you would have with the 10% bonus versus the 12% bonus, and what that means for the champion's overall durability. And you can see it's not a huge increase. Poppy has about 1% more health. This, of course, the delta here doubles when it doubles when she gets low. So it's 1 to 2% more health. It's not a big deal. It's nice, and it looks cool, but it's not a very big deal. Then we have Rakan, again, a required nerf here for mostly high elo solo queue. Also, some for pro play. He wasn't necessarily required to be nerfed, but was clearly the #1 support and a pretty obvious idea to go for. So base armor by 2, armor growth by 0.2. Pretty small stuff. This is pretty light. I think Rakan is likely to still be the #1 support as a result. I don't think that's a problem. I think Rakan is one of the cooler supports to see in pro play. As long as his win rate is reasonable in solo queue, then I'm okay with Rakan being meta in pro for a very long time, because he's one of the flashier, cooler champions overall. I'm pretty happy with the changes that Rakan has had over the year. I'm happy with what we did in 13.3. I'm happy with this change here as well. I think overall positive stuff. So great. Let's look at the numbers here with Rakan. It's not a huge change. 1.5% less physical damage durability at level 1, down to 2.5% less overall physical damage durability at level 18. Keep in mind he's going to build things like Even Shroud or Radiant Virtue or Zeke's Convergence and whatnot. So he's going to have some armor in his build natively anyway. So he's going to feel this less aggressively, because the more armor you have, the less your base stats is going to matter. But that is overall the math of what's going on there. So those are the champion changes. We have some very minor stuff here. With Cosmic Drive, I'm actually a very big fan of the shape of this. Obviously, there's always going to be room for tuning. I'm a very big fan of, because it is with, what's it called? Horizon Focus as well. Just having the items match Shadow Flame, so that the direct comparison is like, okay, well, Shadow Flame is 100 AP, and then some health and some flat pen. And here's Horizon Focus, which is 100 AP. And a bit less health, but some haste and a damage amp on CC. By the way, Horizon Focus is criminally under-purchased on poke mages. Somehow, Xerath and Vel'Koz's are building Shadow Flame more than Horizon Focus. This makes no sense at all. Shame on y'all. Build better. But either way, Cosmic Drive becomes a more obvious direct comparison. And so now what it gives is just simply slowly stacking movement speed over the case of combat, and then you get even more move speed at the very end when you can stack it up over the course of your full 5 seconds. Any damage dealt is going to refresh the stacking buff, and Yeah, basically, just explaining how it works. If you deal once the damage, it'll start stacking. It'll start stacking for 4 seconds, which of course will fall off before this would end. But then as long as you deal again some damage a little bit later, you'll refresh this duration. You'll get the 5 seconds, and you get the big pop of 10 extra move speed at the very end. You don't have to hit them 4 times 1.5 seconds apart. Yep, exactly. So yeah, under the hood, when you deal damage, it applies the tracker buff for 4 seconds. Anytime you deal damage, it refreshes the tracker buff, and then the tracker buff just says every 1.5 seconds, give me a stack of move speed. And then when you have 4 seconds of move speed, give me 10 more, 10% more rather. And that's the way it works under the hood. There's actually a very minor edge case. I did the script review for this, item, which is this item does not give you move speed the instant that you tag someone, because it gives you the tracker buff when you hit somebody, and then 1.5 seconds later, every 1.5 seconds, right, it gives you a stack of move speed, which might feel a little weird. I think there's room to follow this up in a later patch, of course, but hey, by the way, that's how that works. That said, though, I'm very glad that Cosmic Drive just works exactly correctly for Lillia or Singed. If I turn on Poison Trail and you stand on Poison Trail, I will fully stack Cosmic Drive. And what's great, actually, is because Poison Trail, even I hit you once, you touch poison once, because Poison Trail deals damage for 3.25 seconds, I can guarantee that Cosmic Drive fully stacks anytime I damage you with Q, because it will apply damage for long enough. Actually, I guess 2 seconds. But it'll apply damage for long enough that it will last long enough to get the final stack. That'll fall off right away afterwards if you don't stay in combat. But as a Singed player, I'm very happy about this. Yes, it's very greedy, right? It's got no health on it, but I'm excited. I think it's a really cool item. So I'm stoked for this change. I think it's really, really good. I'm glad that the stacking AP over time is not going to be part of it anymore. And look, at the items week, it can be buffed, it can become cheaper, it can give you more move speed, it can stack faster, it can be a million things that could happen here. But I think the idea, the design of this item is actually really good. Clash is coming. You can report from your match history, some challenges updates, Mythic Shop rotation. I did some of the bug fixes in the patch. I'm going to try to find the ones that I did them, because I find them to be interesting always. Let me try to find them, because they should be here, unless they didn't get tracked. I hope they got tracked, though. Here we go. So, Xayah Q bug. Okay, so this is a case of pro players got it wrong. There's a clip on Reddit 2 weeks ago or a week ago, or I think it's a Chinese player. I could be wrong. Saying yeah, once you die once with Xayah, your Q feels way better. That's wrong, by the way. Oh, I see. There's a slightly different bug here, I guess. Okay. So here is actually how Xayah's Q functions. I think some of the wording here I think is actually incorrect. Because I looked at Xayah's script. I used copious debug printouts to for sure know how this works. Okay. So here's how Xayah works, right? When you cast Xayah Q, it runs the script. That's how every spell works. You press a button, it runs a script, right? Okay, it runs Xayah Q script. And basically, it says, okay, I need to do math functionally twice. I need to do math once, which says how long is my cast animation? Right? How long am I literally casting the spell Xayah Q? So I need you to look at my bonus attack speed or look at my attack speed. I don't remember exactly what it was. But it's basically do some math between my highest theoretical attack speed and my lowest theoretical attack speed and where I am, and multiply my cast rate functionally by that number. So I'm somewhere between 0.1 and 0.25 seconds for the cast frame. I know I'm explaining this really poorly. It was a week ago. I've been busy. That's functionally what it does, right? It looks at your numbers and says, okay, spit out a number. That's my new cast animation, right? Okay, cool. It then also does a different bit of math and says, okay, that's neat. There's a different delay, which is when am I allowed to auto attack once I'm done casting. Those are 2 different lockouts. There's, again, how long is my champion doing this? And then she gets to walk. And then there's a time where I get to walk, but I'm not allowed to auto attack yet. And that's also calculated in the script, and then I'm allowed to attack. Actually, I think it's calculated in a separate script. It doesn't matter. But it's fired off. It's all part of the same logical chain. Either way. So the one that asked, basically the module that did the math, that buff, basically it's every time you cast, it like runs that like bit of the script or whatever, and that like throws a variable back at you. It's okay, we have a variable here. This is how long your cast animation is, right? Now use that variable to give yourself a cast time, right? That's my recollection of how that works. That buff didn't persist on death. Because like many buffs go, like when you die with red buff goes away. When you die with Baron buff goes away. When you die with right, that's very common that like buffs disappear when you are killed. The tracker buff for Xayah Q, when that got added like 3 or 4 years ago to get faster based on attack speed, that buff was never flagged to stay on your champion after you died, which means whatever the last thing it sent you, that variable was saved forever. And it was just like, okay, my cast frame is 0.13 seconds. We're done. And it never does that ever again, because the buff no longer exists. And you no longer, because like when Xayah is spawned, it like gives like, or sorry, when Xayah enters the map for the first time, it gives her the Q calculator script, and the first time she dies, the Q calculator script disappears. And so if, for example, you got first blood at level 1, you would just be 0.25 seconds for the entire game. If instead you had like a really big skirmish like level 2 or level 3, and you had Halo Blades on, or you stacked the tempo, or your W was active, that's the big one, your W was active. If you die after casting Q while your W was active and you were stacking lethal tempo, you have snapshotted your Q cast time with like 130% bonus attack speed. And the thing is, when you're not in the middle of a fight, and you're just like, oh, I'm just wave clearing, I'm just going to auto minion, I'm going to press Q and then auto minion again, right? That's the only time you're going to really pay attention to how long your Q takes, because you're not focusing on anything else. And so, yeah, once you've died, you've probably died while fighting someone with lethal tempo stacked, and you press Q at some point during that fight, and then you died for the first time in the game, and then your Q got locked up, and that was your thing forever. And then you would like walk to a mini wave after you respawned, and it would be snapshotted at 0.15 seconds or whatever, and you're like, wow, my Q feels so much faster than the last time I cast Q to mini wave, because it was snapshotted back when your W was active. And so basically it was making that buff persist on death. It ended up being like a mechanically pretty easy fix, but it was like, okay, I'm Xayah, I spawned like a Xayah also on my machine, I like fought themselves, okay, what's my cast frame? Yep, this lines up. What's funny is we had a bug ticket for this that was like, hey, this is like really troll. I'm gonna end up flaming. So we have external QA partners, and they'll frequently like, oh, here's a bug, and like, here's the screenshots of what I'm seeing. And it's like, oh yeah, here's the shop tooltip for the item, here's the in-game tooltip for the item, and they're different. The numbers are different. Oh, that's a good call out. Yeah, we should fix that. Thanks. That's really obvious, and I can see that here's where it is, and yep, okay, cool. For whatever reason, and they'll do videos as well if the video is relevant, but for whatever reason, the bug was, yeah, when you die for the first time, Xayah Q is faster, and here's screenshots of me casting the spell. And I'm like, you can't screenshot cast time. It doesn't say the time. The bar will animate from 0 to full, but you can screenshot at any point in time. So what I ended up doing was like local recording, like standing still, pressing Q, okay, dying, pressing Q, nope, same, and like literally frame by frame, like, nope, it's 8 frames each time. It takes 16 frames to go from bar invisible to bar invisible, because it's 15 frames to cast the spell, or 8 frames, whatever. Sorry, it's 8 frames because it's 8 frames to cast a spell, because it's a quarter second to cast a spell. Because I'm recording, or I'm back. Sorry, it is 16 frames. I'm recording at 60 FPS, and then because if I'm recording at exact 60 FPS, then I know it's exactly 15 frames for a quarter second, and indeed it was 15. And it's like, okay, nope, I'm very confident that just like randomly dying is not doing this. And I definitely fixed a bug where how it was calculating is going correctly. So no, we got it. Okay, this is the right thing. Doing it correctly. Moving on. Okay, so I fixed a Xayah bug. There's a lot of time spent on fixing a Xayah bug. That was interesting. Skin bug fixes weren't me. Okay, great. Patch 13.8 TLDR, this is the MSI patch, kind of version 2 of MSI changes, as we did some stuff in 13.7. Let's talk about what we got going on right here. Aurelion Sol good nerf because of solo queue. He is still a very low elo queue champion. In general, growth stats tend to be tend to disproportionately affect lower MMR play, so Aurelion Sol getting a disproportionately affecting lower MMR set of nerfs to the champion. Next is Ezreal getting a pro-skewed buff, giving him 2 flat AD, which will lift his base damage on his auto attacks, as well as the damage on his Qs, so stronger laning, stronger poke overall. We'll see if we see Ezreal in pro. He's kind of a fringe pick right now in pro, so we might see him a little bit MSI. Garen is arguably a champion that should have a pretty high resting win rate because he is easy to play, and the corollary of that is many players that he is against are bad at the champions they are playing, and that they would beat Garen if they would get good at their champion, but people who bounce around a ton, aren't high mastery, get punished by champions who are easier to play. I think that is a reasonable thing to be in, and Garen, I think, can deserve a little bit of win rate, so 3 AD and 2 armor is a pretty hefty buff. I think it's going to be pretty strong next patch. Janna, kind of a corollary to Garen, is actually a relatively highly mastered champion. Most Janna players are quite good at their champion. And so another champion who actually deserves a pretty high win rate because people who play Janna tend to be actually very, very good at Janna. I'm glad she's not being made into a Q spam bot. It's the more gameplay interacting stuff. So yeah, either Storm is getting buffed in cases where it is a reactive shield and is actively blocking damage. Otherwise, there's no change in the ability. Zephyr is getting buffed in cases where she's actively trading with other people and dealing damage, trying to win the lane. So the more dynamic parts of Janna are getting buffed. I think this is actually well targeted. Cool things to Janna, and Janna going to be a bit stronger. Next up is Jarvan, who interestingly is a low elo skewed win rate jungler right now. So attack damage growth is going to be something that's going to affect that a little bit. 10 flat damage on Dragon Strike is going to simply affect his early gank power. His sort of second, third camp clear is going to be a bit slower because Dragon Strike does 10 less damage. His early gank power is going to be a little bit lower because he's going to do 7 less damage to the actual health bar itself, 10 less damage going through armor. So that matters a little bit there. Overall, yeah, some nerfs to Jarvan, but he really needs them. He's definitely doing too well in solo queue overall. Blue Kayn is like the highest win rate, highest ban rate champion in Chinese solo queue. It's interesting, the distinctions between sort of Western servers and English-speaking servers and the servers that the English-speaking audience kind of like pays attention to and has insight into, and ones that sort of we don't as often. And yeah, Blue Kayn is actually an absolute menace in China, and is a large portion of players, of course, as well. And yeah, Blue Kayn is getting nerfed. Okay, Kha'Zix got some changes in the previous patch that landed pretty well, but he can go a little bit higher, and so 10 flat damage on Q, which is going to be a pretty early skewed jungle buff. I don't think we're going to see Kha'Zix in pro play. I don't think we're going to see him in MSI. It'd be cool if we did. I think he's a cool champion, but I wasn't getting my hopes that we're going to see Assassins at MSI, at least not in jungle. But regardless, Kha'Zix, pretty cool champ, and getting buffed. I think that's totally fine. Kog'Maw gets buffs to pretty much everything but his W. Now ghosted during the passive, 15 to 100 more damage on that as well, 1 second with the Q. And now he is probably worth ranking at level 3 or level 4, which is a pretty big deal and should make this champion, I think, more fun because you have one more button on your keyboard, which is a positive. Leona gets 5 more armor MR as well as 10 more damage in the W. Certainly a pretty solid buff. I think Leona's going to be very strong next patch. Lillia gets some pretty involved changes. She's getting 20 more damage against everything that's not Big Raptor, every large and epic monster in the early game. Again, surely, of course, tapering down to 0 more damage at level 18, but whatever. This actually puts her overall damage cap at really close to around 1,300 at all points in time, which is kind of nice. It's kind of my view on how damage cap should work, that you should try to calculate a relatively similar breakpoint for everybody. Of course, it is a useful tuning lever, so you can't do that for everything ever, but in the mid-thousands, I think is a reasonable damage cap for most champions. The amount of sort of HP that you would approximate for the cap, I think that's reasonable. Either way, clear speed is up early, clear safety up early as well with the flat 15 extra healing. This is basically on the overall application of the Q. This is the healing over the duration. The AP ratio also tripled here, so a very substantial overall health increase in the clear. And not only is it faster, but it's healthier. And then for PvP healing, it's relatively flat. It just requires you to keep buying ability power, which means if you go for Jack, you're probably going to be a little bit less in combat healing as your ability power dips below what an AP build would be. That said, most Lillia's build Liandry's. Jackstro is certainly more performant. It is stronger, but I would like to bring those builds closer together in power level, and upping the AP ratios on the self-healing is a way to help do that, to bridge the gap between the builds that people want to build and the builds that are actually successful. This is kind of like the Senna changes from a little while ago that I think are actually really good. Is that, look, people want to build the champion this way. It's probably okay to let them, instead of let them grief themselves by the build just not being supported by the champion's underlying number tuning. So generally pretty positive with these changes, and I'm happy we're buffing Lillia in this way. Cool beans there. Malphite getting 5 less damage per rank up on the W, and a 5% armor ratio decrease on the follow-up W damage here. Certainly some meaningful Malphite nerfs. could move on from there. Nidalee gets 4 base armor and 0.3 armor growth. This is intended to be a low elo skewed buff to Nidalee. For those who are not very good at clear, they're going to be able to survive the clear better and ultimately lose much less health and have a safer clear overall. Even for the high elo Nidalees who don't take a lot of damage because they're really good at the clear, they still have 4 more armor when they dual Lee Sin over Scuttle Crab. So overall going to be positive, and maybe we see Nidalee at the MSI as a result. Poppy gets 1% more max health damage on her target, as well as 2% more or 2% increased armor and MR via her W passive. This year, this ends up being, we have the data, we're going to go ahead and tab over to it. Poppy is here. Yeah, this ends up being around 6% more damage PvP on the Q, and around 1% more durability via the W, which is of course not a very big deal, but hey, it's there. Congratulations to her. Rakan getting nerfed largely for solo queue. He is also the #1 pro play support, so nerfed for pro, I guess, a bit as well. Somewhat preemptively, again, he was #1. He's going to be #1 MSI if we didn't act, so I think pretty wise to do at least a little bit of something. But again, really terrorizing high elo solo queue, so pretty wise to do that. And it's just a pretty simple change, right? 2 base armor and 0.2 armor growth is not a very large change, but it is going to be win rate negative, which is a good thing for the champion, and a positive change overall for the game. Cosmic Drive has a update to the passive where as long as you deal damage, you will gain a stack every 1.5 seconds. And then after you get all of your stacks, congratulations, you will fully stack, and bam, you're going to be awesome. You're going to be able to get a 20% move speed buff that will survive for the rest of combat. I'm a much bigger fan of Cosmic Drive ramping up and then staying high instead of popping and then decaying back to something kind of mediocre. Cosmic Drive being like, no, you are fast for the rest of the fight. Try to keep the stacks up. Like that's a cool thing where you're like incentivized to go back in, even to be a little bit dangerous. You want to hit something to keep the stacks going. Like I think it's a really cool thing overall. I'm very excited by this. I think it's going to be a cool item overall. And the flat AP gets to once again mirror, shadow, flame, and horizon focus, which I think helps make the choice comparison just that little bit easier. And it's a good thing overall. So cool changes here. I'm excited for MSI. I'll be watching. My eyes will be glued. I'm excited to see what happens. We'll see if any of our changes end up affecting the pro meta or not. I think it'll be a very fun tournament. See you next time. Bye bye.